The wrench slipped from my greasy fingers as I heard Marta's voice drift from the kitchen into my cramped garage. "I'd never let Nathan meet my real friends from the agency," she laughed, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she thought I couldn't hear. "He's just too embarrassing with his grease-stained shirts, and that awful habit of fixing everyone's problems, whether they ask or not." Her girlfriends cackled like hyenas, their wine glasses clinking in appreciation of her wit. I wiped my hands on my coveralls and stood up from under the hood of my battered Toyota, feeling that familiar burn in my chest. 23 years of marriage, and I was still the punchline to her jokes. "Nathan thinks he's being helpful," Marta continued, "but honestly, when he showed up to the Christmas party last year wearing that ridiculous flannel shirt, I wanted to crawl under a rock. Grant said he looked like he'd just crawled out from under a car." Grant. There was that name again. Grant Morrison, the hotshot creative director at Marta's advertising firm. The guy with the Tesla and the trust fund who thought flannel was a fashion crime punishable by public humiliation. I'd met Grant exactly once, at that Christmas party Marta was so fond of mocking. He'd looked at me like I was something stuck to his Italian leather shoe, all while flashing his veneered teeth and talking about his weekend in the Hamptons. The kind of guy who'd never changed his own oil or fixed a leaky faucet, but somehow thought that made him superior. "You should see Nathan's idea of a romantic dinner," Marta was saying now, her voice getting louder as the wine took effect. "He takes me to that greasy diner on Route 9 and thinks ordering the fancy fish and chips is sophisticated. Meanwhile, Grant took me to that new French place downtown last week and—" The wrench clattered to the concrete floor. "Grant took her to dinner? Last week?" I moved closer to the kitchen door, my work boots silent on the oil-stained concrete. Through the crack in the door, I could see Marta gesturing with her wine glass, her blonde hair catching the light from the chandelier she'd insisted we couldn't afford but bought anyway. "Grant has such refined taste," she was saying to her sister Victoria, who nodded approvingly. Victoria had never liked me, not since the day I'd married her precious sister and moved us to this blue-collar neighborhood, instead of the fancy Mills Lake development where she lived. "How do you manage it, Marta?" Victoria asked, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I mean, being married to someone so beneath your station? You've grown so much since you started at the agency, and Nathan is still just Nathan." My wife laughed, a sound that used to make me smile but now felt like fingernails on a chalkboard. "It's not easy, Vic. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never settled, if I'd waited for someone more compatible. Someone like Grant?" Victoria's voice held a knowing tone that made my stomach clench. "Someone exactly like Grant," Marta replied softly. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. 23 years, 2 kids. A mortgage we'd struggled to pay, overtime shifts I'd worked to afford her business school, nights I'd stayed up helping her practice presentations for work. And she was having dinner with Grant. The next morning, Marta left early for what she called a client breakfast. She'd been having a lot of those lately, I realized, along with late nights at the office and weekend team-building exercises that somehow never included spouses. I'd always trusted her completely, stupidly, the way you trust someone you've loved since you were 25 and she was 23, when we'd met at a community college mixer and she'd laughed at my jokes instead of my clothes. But trust, I was learning, was a luxury I could no longer afford. Her iPad sat on the kitchen counter, forgotten in her rush to get to her mysterious breakfast meeting. Marta had never been good with technology, always leaving her devices unlocked, always forgetting passwords. It had been endearing once, the way she'd call me to help her with the simplest computer problems. Now it was just convenient. The messages were all there, laid out like evidence in a case I'd been too blind to see building. Months of them, starting innocent enough but quickly escalating into something that made my coffee taste like ash in my mouth. Grant. Can't stop thinking about yesterday. You're incredible. Marta. Nathan's working late again. Come over around 8? Grant. Your husband has no idea what he's got. His loss is my gain. Marta, he's so clueless. Sometimes I think he wouldn't notice if I moved out completely. The timestamps showed they'd been texting while I was in the next room, while I was making her coffee in the morning, while I was fixing the leaky faucet she'd been complaining about for months. I scrolled further back, my hands shaking, hotel receipts forwarded from her email, photos I definitely hadn't taken, plans for weekend getaways during my supposed guys' trips to the boxing gym. The boxing gym, where I'd been going to blow off steam from a marriage I thought was just going through a rough patch, never realizing my wife was using my absence to screw another man in our bed. My phone buzzed. A text from my daughter Amelia, away at college. Dad, did you see Mom's Facebook post about growing apart from people who don't share your values? People are asking questions. Call me. I didn't need to see the post. I could imagine it perfectly. Marta laying the groundwork, painting herself as the victim of a marriage that had run its course, preparing her social media audience for the inevitable announcement that she was leaving her blue-collar husband for someone more compatible. The garage felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in like a vice. I needed air, space, somewhere to think. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I forwarded the most damning messages to my own phone, then deleted the evidence of my snooping. If Marta wanted to play games, she was about to learn that 23 years of marriage had taught me a few things about her weaknesses too, starting with her precious reputation. The Founders' Day Gala was Lakefield's annual attempt to pretend we were something more than a faded Midwestern town with more empty storefronts than thriving businesses. Held at the Mills Lake Country Club, it was where the town's self-appointed elite gathered to pat themselves on the back and remind everyone else where they stood in the social hierarchy. Marta had insisted I come, despite spending the previous week dropping hints about how I never fit in at these events. Just try not to embarrass me, she'd said while adjusting my tie with the resigned air of someone dressing a child for a school play. I should have known something was wrong when she spent 2 hours getting ready, trying on 3 different dresses before settling on a red number that cost more than my monthly truck payment. She'd been checking her phone constantly, smiling at messages she didn't share. The country club's main ballroom was decorated with the kind of understated elegance that screamed expensive. Round tables covered in white linens, centerpieces that probably cost more than most people's grocery budgets, and a string quartet playing background music that nobody listened to, but everyone pretended to appreciate. Marta immediately gravitated toward her work colleagues, leaving me to nurse a beer at the bar while she air-kissed her way through the crowd. I watched her work the room with the practiced ease of someone who'd found her element, her laugh carrying over the polite conversation like a bell. That's when I saw Grant. He was holding court near the silent auction table, surrounded by a group of admirers, hanging on his every word about some campaign his team had developed for a luxury car dealership. He wore his success like cologne, heavy and obvious, from his perfectly styled hair to his Italian shoes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. When he spotted Marta, his face lit up with the kind of smile that made my stomach turn. Not the polite, professional smile you'd give a colleague's spouse, but something intimate and possessive. Nathan! Victoria appeared at my elbow like a shark sensing weakness. My sister-in-law wore her usual expression of barely concealed disdain, her eyes already scanning the room for more important people to talk to. How nice to see you here. I wasn't sure you'd be comfortable with this crowd. I'm full of surprises, I replied, watching as Grant made his way over to where Marta stood with a group of women from her office. Yes, well, Victoria sniffed, we all have our place in the world, don't we? Some of us are meant for bigger things. Grant had reached Marta now, and I watched as he placed his hand on the small of her back, a gesture that lasted just a moment too long to be casual. She leaned into him slightly, her body language screaming intimacy to anyone who cared to look, which apparently was everyone except me until now. They make a striking couple, don't they? Victoria's voice held a note of malicious satisfaction. So well suited. Both successful, both ambitious, both refined. The message was clear enough. Unlike your blue-collar husband who changes oil for a living. I took a long pull of my beer and watched as Grant whispered something in Marta's ear that made her throw back her head and laugh. The sound carried across the room, drawing appreciative glances from the other guests who clearly saw what I was only now beginning to understand. This wasn't just an affair. This was a public audition for my replacement. "Excuse me," I said to Victoria, setting down my beer with more force than necessary. I made my way across the room, weaving between tables of Lakefield's finest citizens, all of whom seemed to be watching the drama unfold with the barely contained excitement of people who'd finally found something interesting to talk about at one of these boring events. "Grant," I said as I approached their little group. "Good to see you again." He turned toward me with that practiced smile, but I caught the flicker of annoyance that crossed his features before he could hide it. "Nathan, great to see you, buddy. How's the auto repair business?" The way he said it made it sound like I collected garbage for a living. The women in Marta's group exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from pity to amusement. "Can't complain," I replied easily. "People always need their cars fixed, especially expensive ones that break down a lot." Grant's smile tightened slightly. He drove a Tesla, a fact he'd mentioned approximately 17 times during our first meeting. "Well," Marta interjected quickly, "Grant was just telling us about the Morrison account. It's going to be huge for the agency." "The Morrison account?" I asked, looking between them. "Any relation to you, Grant?" A flush crept up his neck. "It's my family's business, actually. My father thought the agency would be perfect for their new campaign. Of course, Daddy's money funding another one of Grant's successes." I wondered if Marta knew her boyfriend was basically a trust fund baby playing at being a businessman, or if she just didn't care as long as the money kept flowing. "That's convenient," I said. "Nothing like keeping it in the family." The group fell silent, sensing the undercurrent of tension. Grant's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Nathan," Marta said sharply, "why don't you go get yourself another drink?" The dismissal was clear, delivered in front of her colleagues like I was an embarrassing relative who'd had too much to drink. The women in her group looked everywhere except at me, their second-hand embarrassment palpable. "Actually," Grant said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure nearby tables could hear, "I was hoping to get Nathan's opinion on something. Marta's been telling me about your situation at home, the financial pressures, the stress of trying to keep up with her success. It must be difficult, being married to someone who's outgrown their circumstances." The words hit like physical blows. Around us, conversations had quieted as people strained to hear what was clearly becoming the evening's entertainment. "Grant," Marta said quietly, but she didn't deny what he'd said, didn't defend me or tell him he was out of line. She just stood there, her face flushed with embarrassment at being associated with me. "I mean," Grant continued, warming to his theme, "it takes a special kind of man to be comfortable with his wife being the primary breadwinner. Not everyone can handle that kind of role reversal." He was enjoying this. The subtle public humiliation, the way he could destroy me with polite words and concerned expressions while positioning himself as the successful alternative. The kind of man who could give Marta the life she deserved. I looked at my wife, waiting for her to say something, anything, to defend the marriage we'd built together. Instead, she was staring at the floor, her cheeks burning with shame. Not shame at Grant's behavior, I realized. Shame at being married to me. "You're right," I said finally, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room. "It does take a special kind of man. The kind who works 60-hour weeks to put his wife through business school. The kind who takes second jobs to afford the clothes and cars and lifestyle she wants. The kind who celebrates her successes even when she's too busy to notice his." The room had gone completely silent now, all pretense of polite conversation abandoned as everyone waited to see how this would play out. But you know what takes an even more special kind of man, Grant, I continued, stepping closer to him. The kind who screws another man's wife and then has the balls to lecture that man about inadequacy in public. Gasps echoed around the room. Marta's face went white, then red, then white again. Grant's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Nathan," Marta whispered, "please don't do this here." "Do what here?" I asked, my voice still calm and conversational. "Tell the truth? Share some of those intimate details you've been texting about? Because I've got months of messages, Marta. Months of planning and scheming and laughing about how clueless your husband is." Victoria appeared at Marta's side like she'd materialized from thin air, her face a mask of fury. "How dare you make a scene like this? Have you lost your mind?" "Actually," I said, turning to address the room full of wide-eyed spectators, "I think I've finally found it." Amazing what clarity you get when you discover your wife has been auditioning her replacement in public while planning her exit strategy in private. I pulled out my phone and held it up so the nearest tables could see the screen. Should I read some of the highlights? There are some really creative descriptions of my shortcomings, and some very detailed plans for romantic getaways funded by Daddy's money. "Stop," Marta pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Nathan, just stop." But I was done stopping, done being quiet, done being embarrassed, done pretending that keeping the peace was more important than keeping my dignity. "You want to know what's really embarrassing, Marta? It's not my job or my clothes or the fact that I don't summer in the Hamptons. It's being married to someone who's been lying to my face for months while planning to humiliate me in front of the entire town." I turned back to Grant, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "And you, Grant, you want to be the man in her life? Congratulations. You can have her. But remember something. If she'll cheat with you, she'll cheat on you. Ask me how I know." With that, I walked out of the ballroom, leaving behind 23 years of marriage and a room full of people who would be talking about this night for years to come. The parking lot was quiet, except for the sound of my boots on asphalt and the distant music drifting from the country club. I sat in my truck for a long moment, my hands shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. My phone buzzed with text after text. Marta, Victoria, even a few people from the party. I turned it off without reading them. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The boxing gym at 6 a.m. was my church, and Eli Martinez was its gruff priest. At 62, the former cop-turned-gym owner had seen enough of life's ugliness to dispense wisdom along with training advice, usually while I worked out my frustrations on the heavy bag. "Heard you caused quite a stir at the country club," Eli said, wrapping my hands with practiced efficiency. Word traveled fast in a town like Lakefield, especially when it involved public humiliation at the social event of the year. "News travels fast," I replied, testing the raps with a few experimental punches. "Faster when it's good news," Eli grinned. "Half the town's been waiting for someone to take Grant Morrison down a peg. Kid's been coasting on Daddy's money since high school, acting like he invented success." I started working the bag, letting the rhythm of my punches match the anger still burning in my chest. Doesn't change the fact that my marriage is over and my wife's been playing me for a fool. "Maybe," Eli said, settling onto a bench to watch me work. "Or maybe it's time to stop playing defense and start playing offense." I paused mid-punch. "What do you mean?" "I mean you spent 23 years being the good guy, Nathan. Working your ass off, supporting her dreams, keeping your mouth shut when she treated you like an embarrassment. Where'd that get you? Divorced and humiliated in front of the entire town." "Exactly. So maybe it's time to try a different approach." Eli had a point. I'd spent so long trying to be the bigger person, the understanding husband, the guy who didn't make waves. Meanwhile, Marta and Grant had been making waves all over town, and I'd been too blind or too stupid to see them. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that if someone wants to play dirty, you don't win by playing clean. You win by playing smarter." That afternoon, I drove past Grant's luxury condo complex on the other side of town. The kind of place with a doorman and valet parking where the monthly fees probably exceeded my mortgage payment. His Tesla was parked in its assigned spot, gleaming like a monument to his superiority. I'd always been good with my hands, good at fixing things and taking them apart. It was a skill that had served me well in my auto repair business, but it had other applications too. The beauty of expensive cars is that they're complicated. Lots of sophisticated systems that can malfunction in subtle ways. Nothing dangerous or illegal, just inconvenient. A few strategic disconnections in the right places, and Grant's pride and joy would become a very expensive paperweight. The kind of problem that would require multiple tow truck visits and leave him stranded at the worst possible moments. But that was just the beginning. I spent the next few days doing research, the kind of investigation I should have been doing months ago. Grant Morrison wasn't just a trust fund baby. He was a trust fund baby with secrets. His family's business, Morrison Industries, had been struggling for years. The advertising account he'd brought to Marta's agency wasn't a sign of success. It was a desperate attempt to rebrand a failing company. The luxury lifestyle, the expensive condo, the Tesla, all of it was funded by rapidly depleting family money. More interesting was Grant's employment history. 3 agencies in 5 years, each departure following what HR departments euphemistically called interpersonal difficulties. In plain English, Grant had a habit of sleeping with colleagues and creating hostile work environments when those relationships went south. Marta wasn't his first affair with a married coworker. She wasn't even his second, but she was about to be his last. I started small. Anonymous tips to the agency's HR department about Grant's pattern of behavior, complete with documentation I'd found through public records and social media. Nothing illegal, nothing that couldn't be verified, just information that painted a picture of a man who used his position and family connections to take advantage of female employees. Then I got creative. Grant's social media presence was extensive and poorly secured, the kind of guy who posted every meal, every purchase, every thought that crossed his mind. He'd been documenting his affair with Marta in barely coded posts about new beginnings and finding someone who appreciates the finer things. It was easy enough to create anonymous accounts and start connecting the dots for his followers. Screenshots of his posts alongside photos from Marta's Facebook page, showing them at the same restaurants on the same nights. Timeline comparisons that made their relationship obvious to anyone who cared to look. And in a town like Lakefield, everyone cared to look. Within a week, Grant's professional reputation was in shambles. The HR investigation had expanded beyond his relationship with Marta to include his entire employment history. The Morrison Industries account was pulled from the agency after someone, not me, but I had my suspicions about who, leaked information about the company's financial troubles to their competitors. Grant's condo was broken into twice in 3 days, though nothing was stolen. Just rearranged, moved, disturbed in ways that would make him feel unsafe and paranoid. His Tesla developed mysterious electrical problems that left him stranded in increasingly embarrassing locations. But I was just getting started. The real target wasn't Grant. He was just the symptom. The disease was the entire social structure that had allowed people like him and Victoria to treat people like me as expendable, embarrassing, less than human. Marta had made her choice, and she was welcome to it. But she was going to understand exactly what that choice cost her. I started with her sister. Victoria's weakness had always been her need to appear perfect, successful, better than everyone around her. She lived in the Mills Lake development, drove a luxury SUV she couldn't afford, and maintained a lifestyle that was all appearance and no substance. It wasn't hard to discover that Victoria's perfect life was built on credit cards and loans, that her husband's consulting business was failing, that their house was 3 months behind on mortgage payments. The kind of information that was public record if you knew where to look. The beauty of financial pressure is that it makes people desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. I started leaving anonymous tips for Victoria's creditors, letting them know about assets she'd been hiding, purchases she'd been making while claiming poverty. Nothing illegal, just thorough. Within days, her perfect world began cracking at the edges. Repo men, collection calls, legal notices that arrived when her neighbors could see them. The kind of public humiliation she'd been so eager to dish out to others. But the real masterstroke was yet to come. Marta's agency was hosting their annual client appreciation dinner at the end of the month. The kind of event where careers were made and destroyed, where reputations were cemented or shattered. The kind of event where a well-timed revelation could destroy multiple lives at once. I had a month to prepare, and I intended to make it count. After all, they'd taught me that reputation was everything in their world. It was time to show them what happened when that reputation was built on lies, betrayal, and the assumption that some people were too stupid or too weak to fight back. They were about to learn how wrong they'd been. The Morrison Industries collapse made the front page of the Lakefield Gazette, complete with photos of Grant's father being led away in handcuffs. Embezzlement, tax fraud, and securities violations. The kind of white-collar crime that destroyed entire families and left investors holding worthless paper. I read the article over coffee in the same diner where I'd first heard whispers about Marta's late nights, savoring the irony. Grant's trust fund hadn't just dried up, it had been built on stolen money from the beginning. "Terrible thing," said Mrs. Flanagan, sliding into the booth across from me without invitation. The town's unofficial gossip coordinator had never met a scandal she couldn't improve with speculation. That poor boy, finding out his whole life was a lie. Tragic, I agreed, not bothering to hide my satisfaction. "Course I heard he's been having troubles of his own," she continued, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Lost his job at that fancy advertising agency. Something about inappropriate relationships with married women. The beauty of small-town gossip is that it grows in the telling, becoming more scandalous and more accurate with each repetition. By the time Mrs. Flanagan was done with Grant's story, he'd be lucky to get a job selling used cars in the next county." "Speaking of which," she said, her eyes gleaming with malicious curiosity, "how are you holding up?" "Must be difficult, with Marta and all." "I'm managing," I replied, finishing my coffee. "Sometimes life has a way of working things out." That afternoon, I drove to Victoria's house in the Mills Lake development. The "For Sale" sign on the front lawn was already tilted at an angle, suggesting a hasty installation. Victoria's luxury SUV was gone, replaced by a 10-year-old sedan that probably belonged to her husband. I didn't stop, just drove slowly past the house where my sister-in-law had once held court, dispensing judgment on people she considered beneath her station. The windows were dark, and the perfectly manicured lawn was already showing signs of neglect. Financial ruin had a way of humbling people who'd forgotten what humility felt like. But Victoria's downfall was just a warm-up act for the main event. The client appreciation dinner was being held at the Mills Lake Country Club, the same venue where my marriage had publicly imploded 3 weeks earlier. Marta's agency had rented the entire facility, transforming it into a showcase of their success and sophistication. I wasn't invited, of course, but that had never stopped me before. The catering staff was provided by a local company I'd done work for, and the owner owed me a favor from when I'd kept his delivery truck running during a particularly brutal winter. It wasn't hard to arrange for an extra uniform and a temporary position serving drinks at the bar. Amazing how invisible service workers become to people who consider themselves important. I watched the evening unfold from behind the bar, serving drinks to people who'd known me for years without recognition. Marta moved through the crowd like a woman trying too hard to appear confident, her smile just a little too bright, her laugh just a little too loud. Grant wasn't there. His termination from the agency had been swift and final once the HR investigation concluded. His absence left Marta in an awkward position, trying to maintain her professional composure while her personal life crumbled around her. The agency's senior partners were holding court at the head table, discussing the Morrison Industries debacle and its impact on their business. They'd lost a major account, suffered a public relations nightmare, and were dealing with the fallout from Grant's behavior. Someone needed to be held accountable for the mess. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering information and documentation that painted a clear picture of what had really happened. Not just the affair, but the preferential treatment Grant had received because of his family connections. The corners that had been cut, the warning signs that had been ignored, the complaints that had been buried, and Marta's role in all of it. As the evening progressed and the alcohol flowed, conversations became more candid. I listened from behind the bar as the partners discussed their options, their voices carrying clearly in the acoustically perfect room. "Someone has to take responsibility for this disaster," said Richard Hawthorne, the agency's founding partner. "We can't just blame Morrison and move on. There were red flags everywhere." "Grant's gone," replied his business partner, Sarah Chen. "Isn't that enough?" "Grant was a symptom," Hawthorne said firmly. "The real problem was the culture that allowed this to happen. The favoritism, the lack of oversight, the willingness to look the other way as long as the money kept coming in." I could see Marta from across the room, her face pale as she pretended to listen to a client's story while obviously straining to hear the partner's conversation. "What about Marta Wells?" Chen asked quietly. "She was Grant's primary collaborator on the Morrison account. And there are rumors about their personal relationship." "More than rumors," Hawthorne replied grimly. "HR has documentation going back months, text messages, hotel receipts, expense reports that don't add up. She was using company resources to facilitate an affair while compromising our professional standards." This was my moment. I stepped out from behind the bar and approached their table, carrying a tray of drinks I'd prepared specifically for this conversation. "Excuse me, gentlemen," I said, setting down their glasses with practiced efficiency. "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion about the Morrison situation." Hawthorne looked up, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place my face. "Do I know you?" "Nathan Wells," I replied calmly. "Marta's husband. Soon-to-be ex-husband." The silence that fell over their table was deafening. Chen's mouth actually fell open, while Hawthorne's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and finally, intense interest. "Mr. Wells," he said carefully, "this is highly irregular." "So was my wife's affair with your former employee," I replied, pulling out my phone. "But since you're discussing her professional future, I thought you might be interested in some additional context." I showed them the screen, where months of text messages were displayed in chronological order. Not just the affair, but the business implications. Marta sharing confidential client information with Grant, using company credit cards for personal expenses, lying on expense reports about the nature of her relationship with him. "Jesus Christ," Chen whispered, scrolling through the messages. "This is a compliance nightmare." "It gets worse," I said, swiping to a new set of screenshots. "She's been shopping these client contacts to other agencies, preparing to jump ship with Grant when the Morrison money ran out." Hawthorne's face had gone from pale to red to a dangerous shade of purple. "How did you get these?" "She left her iPad unlocked," I said simply. "Amazing what you can learn when someone thinks you're too stupid to pay attention." Across the room, Marta had noticed our conversation and was making her way toward us, her professional smile faltering as she read the expressions on her bosses' faces. "Nathan?" she said as she approached, her voice carefully controlled. "What are you doing here?" "Having a conversation with your employers about professional ethics," I replied. "We were just discussing your future with the agency." The color drained from her face as she saw the phone in Hawthorne's hand, the damning evidence of her betrayal displayed for her bosses to see. "I can explain," she began, but Hawthorne held up a hand to stop her. "Ms. Wells," he said formally, "I think you should clear your schedule for tomorrow morning. We'll be conducting a thorough review of your employment with this agency, and I suspect you'll want to have legal representation present." Marta's carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time, and everyone in the room was beginning to notice. Conversations were stopping as people turned to watch the drama unfold at the head table. "You bastard," she whispered, her professional composure finally cracking. "How could you do this to me?" "The same way you did it to me," I replied. "Except I had the courtesy to do it in private first. You chose to make it public." I turned back to Hawthorne and Chen, who were still scrolling through the evidence of their employee's betrayal. "Gentlemen, I'll leave you to your business decisions. But you might want to check your client contracts for non-compete clauses. I believe you'll find that several of your former clients have been contacted by competing agencies in the past few weeks." With that, I walked away from the table, leaving Marta to face the consequences of her choices alone. But I wasn't done yet. The real finale was still to come. The Founders' Day Fair was Lakefield's annual celebration of its modest history, complete with carnival rides that had seen better decades, food vendors selling overpriced corn dogs, and a main stage where local politicians made speeches nobody listened to. It was also the perfect venue for what I had planned. 3 months had passed since the client dinner debacle, and the fallout had been everything I'd hoped for and more. Marta had been terminated from the agency amid a flurry of legal threats and breach of contract lawsuits. Grant had fled town entirely, last seen working at a car dealership in Ohio. Victoria's house had been foreclosed on, and she'd moved in with relatives in another state. But I wasn't satisfied with their quiet destruction. They'd chosen to humiliate me publicly, and I believed in returning favors in kind. The fair's main stage was used throughout the day for various presentations: the high school band, local business promotions, and the traditional evening raffle that served as the event's grand finale. As someone who'd grown up in Lakefield and knew half the organizing committee, it hadn't been difficult to volunteer my services as a technical assistant. Amazing how helpful people become when your marriage explodes in spectacular fashion and you're suddenly the town's most sympathetic figure. I spent the morning setting up sound equipment and testing microphones, making sure everything would work perfectly when the time came. The evening raffle was always well attended, drawing most of the fair's visitors to the main stage area for the drawing of prizes donated by local businesses. It would be the perfect audience for my final performance. Marta arrived at the fair around 6 o'clock, looking like a woman trying desperately to maintain normalcy. She'd been living with her parents since losing her job and apartment, and the stress was showing. Her clothes were less expensive, her hair less perfectly styled, her confident stride replaced by the uncertain steps of someone who'd lost their place in the world. She was accompanied by her friend Jennifer from the old agency days, one of the few people who'd stood by her through the scandal. They bought tickets for the raffle and found seats near the front of the stage, close enough for what I had planned. As the sun set and the stage lights came on, Mayor Davidson took the microphone to begin the evening's festivities. The usual speeches about community spirit and local pride, the kind of civic theater that everyone endured to get to the prizes. "Before we begin tonight's raffle," the mayor announced, "we have a special presentation from one of our longtime residents, Nathan Wells." The crowd applauded politely as I walked onto the stage, adjusting the microphone to accommodate my height. Marta's face went white as she realized what was happening, but she was trapped in the front row with hundreds of people behind her. "Thank you, Mayor Davidson," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the fairgrounds. "I wanted to take a few minutes tonight to talk about something that's been on my mind lately. Something I think a lot of you can relate to." I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the crowd until they found Marta's terrified face. Betrayal. The word hung in the air like a physical presence. The crowd, which had been chattering and restless, suddenly gave me their full attention. "Most of you know that my marriage ended recently," I continued. "Some of you were there at the country club when it happened. Some of you heard about it later. But I don't think many of you know the whole story." Marta was trying to stand up, to leave, but the crowd behind her made escape impossible without causing a scene. She was trapped, forced to listen as I prepared to destroy what remained of her reputation. You see, I thought I had a marriage built on love and mutual respect. I thought I had a wife who was pursuing her dreams while I supported our family. I thought I was part of a team. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the sound system, the large screens flanking the stage coming to life with images I'd prepared. Instead, I had a wife who was using our marriage as a cover story while she pursued other interests. The first image appeared on the screens, a text message conversation between Marta and Grant, their words magnified for the entire crowd to read. Gasps echoed across the fairgrounds as people realized what they were seeing. "These are just a few of the messages I found on my wife's iPad," I explained as more images cycled through. Months of planning, scheming, and laughing about how stupid her husband was. Marta was crying now, her hands covering her face as the crowd around her began to murmur and point. Some people were taking pictures with their phones, documenting the moment for social media posterity. But the affair was just the beginning, I continued, advancing to a new set of images. It turns out that adultery and professional ethics violations often go hand in hand. The screens now showed expense reports, client lists, and email exchanges that documented Marta's breach of professional standards. The crowd might not understand all the legal implications, but they could certainly grasp the basic concept of stealing from your employer. "My wife didn't just cheat on me," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned fairgrounds. "She cheated her employers, her clients, and everyone who trusted her to do her job with integrity." I clicked to the final set of images. Bank records showing the money Marta and Grant had spent on their affair, all of it funded by fraudulent expense reports and misappropriated company funds. The total cost of their romantic getaways came to just over $37,000, I announced, none of which was their own money. The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were openly staring at Marta, their expressions ranging from shock to disgust to the kind of righteous anger that small towns specialized in. "Now, I know what some of you are thinking," I continued. "Why air this dirty laundry in public? Why not handle it privately, like civilized people?" I paused for effect, letting the question hang in the air. "Because my wife and her boyfriend didn't handle it privately. They made it a public spectacle, flaunting their affair at every social event in town while treating me like an embarrassment. They wanted an audience for their romance, so I thought I'd give them an audience for its consequences." Marta finally managed to stand up, pushing past the people in her row as she fled toward the parking lot. But it was too late. The damage was done, recorded on dozens of phones, and witnessed by hundreds of people who would spread the story throughout the region. "In closing," I said, as the crowd watched Marta's retreat, "I want to thank everyone who supported me through this difficult time. Your friendship and loyalty mean more than you know." I paused one final time, looking out at the sea of faces staring back at me. "And to those who thought I was too stupid, too weak, or too embarrassed to fight back, I hope tonight's presentation has been educational." The crowd erupted in applause as I walked off the stage, leaving behind the wreckage of my wife's reputation and the satisfaction of a job well done. Grant's Tesla was in the parking lot, apparently repaired from its recent mechanical difficulties. He was leaning against it, waiting for me with the kind of expression that suggested violence was imminent. "You son of a bastard," he snarled as I approached. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've told the truth," I replied calmly. "Something you might want to try sometime." He swung at me then, a wild haymaker that telegraphed itself from 3 feet away. 20 years of boxing training made the response automatic. I ducked under his punch, stepped inside his guard, and drove my fist into his solar plexus. Grant folded like a cheap suit, gasping for air as he collapsed against his precious car. I grabbed him by his designer shirt and pulled him upright, making sure he could see my face clearly. "You wanted to humiliate me in public," I said quietly. "You wanted to take my wife, my reputation, my place in this community. Well, congratulations. You got exactly what you asked for." I released him and stepped back, watching as he slumped against the Tesla's gleaming paint job. Enjoy your new life, Grant. Both of you. You've earned it. I walked away then, leaving him gasping in the parking lot while the sounds of the fair continued behind us. The raffle was still going on, people were still winning prizes, and life in Lakefield was moving forward without Marta, Grant, or their toxic drama. I had won. Not just the immediate battle, but the larger war for my dignity, my reputation, and my right to be treated with basic human respect. They had underestimated me, dismissed me as too weak or too stupid to fight back effectively. They had been wrong. The crowd's applause was still echoing in my ears as I drove home to my small apartment above the auto shop, finally free from a marriage that had been slowly destroying me for years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and a future built on my own terms rather than someone else's expectations. But tonight, I was content to savor the sweet taste of perfect revenge, served cold and in public, just the way they had served their betrayal to me. They had taught me that reputation was everything in their world. I had simply been a better student than they expected.